guys, it's time for your last video of the semester, talking about the reproductive system. So we'll be focusing on the production of gametes. So in the male, that would be called spermatogenesis. I'm sorry, the trash truck just decided to come by, so that's what you hear in the background. So spermatogenesis for the male, and in the female, it's oogenesis. So in spermatogenesis, it's the production of spermatocytes in the end, and for oogenesis, it's the production of oocytes in the end. So we'll be talking about those processes, and then also the hormones that play into the different cycles that contribute to this. So let's start with the male. When we're looking at the male and we're looking at spermatogenesis, we're talking about the seminiferous tubules in the testes, which are just a bunch of tubules that are all coiled up and wrapped around, and there's a center of the tubule. If you were to look at the tubule in cross-section, there'd be outer edges where you have cells, and these would be the stem cells. And then the stem cells would be dividing and moving in closer toward the center of the tubule, which would be the lumen. And eventually you would end up with the spermatocyte, which is what would come out of the seminiferous tubules through the efferent ductules into the epididymis, and so on and so forth, through all the structures that you know from lab. Now, the hormones that are involved with the male reproductive system, we need to think about the hypothalamus, which we've already learned. We know gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and we know that it goes to the anterior pituitary and it causes the production of the gonadotropins. And those gonadotropins are FSH, or follicle-stimulating hormone, and LH, or luteinizing hormone. And those two hormones are going to go to the testes and do two different things. Let's follow FSH first. So FSH goes down to the seminiferous tubules, which are these tubules that we just talked about, and it stimulates a type of cell inside the seminiferous tubule that's called the Tacular cells. These tacular cells can also be called nurse cells. They are things that assist with spermatogenesis. They're not the stem cells. They're not directly involved with spermatogenesis, but they help to attract testosterone to the area, which helps to stimulate the cells that do spermatogenesis. They help to create the blood-testes barrier, which is going to protect the stem cells from any substances that are in the blood that are not conducive to spermatogenesis, things like that. So they're assisting the developing spermatocytes. Now for LH is going to also go to the testes, but it goes to cells that are outside of the tubule, and those are called the interstitial cells, or the interstitial cells of Leydig. These are the cells that produce testosterone that help to stimulate spermatogenesis, among other things. Testosterone also helps to trigger parts of the central nervous system. It helps to form secondary male sex characteristics, things like that. Now, when the interstitial cells are being stimulated by LH, and when the subtacular cells are being stimulated by FSH, they're going to secrete a hormone called inhibins. And inhibins go back up to the hypothalamus and inhibit GnRH. And when you inhibit GnRH, it inhibits FSH and LH, and it decreases spermatogenesis because you're not stimulating the subtacular cells. It decreases the level of testosterone because you're not stimulating the interstitial cells. And then when those two things decrease activity, then we decrease the inhibins, and that allows GnRH to build back up again. More FSH, more LH, we start stimulating these again, but then you start stimulating the inhibins. So you see a little negative feedback loop forming here. And this is, important so that you don't just keep overstimulating everything. You need to keep it in a nice balance. And this is a cycle that will be happening on a daily basis in the male. So testosterone levels will be fluctuating up when you have surges of GnRH, FSH, and LH. We'll get more testosterone. And then as the inhibins come in and inhibit GnRH, FSH, and LH, will start to decrease the testosterone. So this is a daily up and down in the level of testosterone in the male. Now, for the female, there's also going to be sort of the same sort of situation, but instead of, let's just use this picture instead of this for right now. Instead of having, sustentacular cells in the seminiferous tubules and interstitial cells, we'll be dealing with ovaries. So these would be cells in the ovary that produce estrogen here, and follicular cells that surround the oocytes. And when they're being stimulated by FSH and LH, they also secrete inhibins, which do the same thing. Now, there's some other situations that happen in the female, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes, that makes it a little bit more complex, and it makes this a longer cycle. In the male, it's a daily cycle. In the female, it's about a 28-day cycle. Now, let's switch over to this page here. So we're going to be looking at the seminiferous tubule, and instead of focusing on the sustentacular cells, I just took those out entirely, and I just put in these stem cells, which would be all along the edge of the tubule. So if we were looking at it from a sideways view, so this would be the lumen, this would be where the spermatocytes would be, right in the lumen, and then on the edge here would be these stem cells. And these stem cells are called spermatogonia. One spermatogonium, more than one spermatogonia. So they're going to undergo mitosis and create two daughter cells. And every time you divide, you know this, you create two daughter cells. So we're just going to always follow just one daughter cell to keep things simple. So as we divide the spermatogonium, two daughter cells through mitosis, and those daughter cells are called primary spermatocytes. Then the primary spermatocytes undergo meiosis 1, two daughter cells again for each one, and those are called secondary spermatocytes. Then the secondary spermatocytes undergo meiosis 2, and now we are in the lumen of the tubule, and we have spermatids. The spermatids are just going to develop more. They're not going to go through any further divisions, but they're just going to develop more over the period of a day or so and become the spermatocyte. So this would be a daily process. This is happening all the time in the male, where the spermatogonium are going through mitosis, and then meiosis 1 for the primary spermatocytes, meiosis 2 for the secondary spermatocytes, and then the spermatids developing. So this is something that just goes in a nice, easy flow: mitosis, meiosis 1, meiosis 2, all one after the other. In the female, over here, with oogenesis, we start with something called oogonia, or an oogonium for one, and that's going to be in the fetus. So these are the stem cells, and these would be what you would find in a female before birth, so not after birth. So what's going to be happening, a lot of this is happening before you're even born as a female. So there's going to be some pauses, and there's going to be beginnings of processes, and then a not finishing of the process for some time, and then finally completing the process in the end. Sometimes, not all the time. So let's go through this. So in the fetus, there is an oogonium, and it goes through mitosis. This is still prenatal, so still as a fetus, and it creates the primary oocyte and a polar body. So two daughter cells, but they're not equal. And I should have drawn this. This should be really teeny tiny, the polar body. So the polar body would be teeny tiny. The primary oocyte would be bigger. It would get the bulk of the cytoplasm. It would get pretty much all the stuff. The polar body is just a throwaway cell. It's just going to kind of not do anything after that. So we're just following the one daughter cell through this. So mitosis here, this is completed before birth. Then, still before birth, this primary oocyte is going to begin meiosis 1, but it's not going to finish. It's going to stop right in the middle of meiosis 1 in the prophase stage, and it's just going to wait. And it's going to wait until the female is born. It's going to wait until the female goes through puberty, and at puberty, one or possibly two of these primary oocytes will finish this meiosis 1. about once a month or so. So in a cycle of a month, the female monthly cycle. So some of these primary oocytes can be just sitting there hanging out in the middle of prophase 1 for up to about 50 years, which is when menopause happens, and then no more finishing of meiosis 1 after that. But beginning after puberty, so at least maybe 11, 12, 13 years is when the first ones begin to complete their meiosis 1. So let's just follow one that is completing the process. So this one primary oocyte has begun meiosis 1 before birth. It's waited, it's after puberty, and now it is about to take its turn to finish meiosis 1. It'll finish meiosis 1 and form a secondary oocyte, and again a polar body, which I should have made a little bit smaller, a little tiny thing. It just kind of goes away. The polar body isn't going to do much of anything, but we get the secondary oocyte here, which gets the bulk of the cytoplasm from the division. It gets all the stuff. So this secondary oocyte itself is going to begin meiosis 2, but it's not going to finish. It's going to pause, just like the primary oocyte paused in the middle of meiosis 1. So while the secondary oocyte is paused in the middle of meiosis 2, it's going to develop a little further into a tertiary oocyte. Now, that is what would eventually be ovulated out of the ovary, which we're going to get into in a second. But after ovulation, this tertiary oocyte will still be just sitting there in the middle of meiosis 2, and it's going to get into the fallopian tubes, travel down the fallopian tubes, and if it meets up with the spermatocyte in the fallopian tubes, and that spermatocyte fertilizes that oocyte, then it will finish meiosis 2. So we start out before birth as an oogonium, which goes through mitosis, forming a polar body, which we don't really care about, and a primary oocyte. The primary oocyte starts meiosis 1, hangs out in the middle of meiosis 1 until puberty, or all the way up until menopause. And about once a month or so, one of them, maybe two of them, will finish meiosis 1, form a secondary oocyte, which will begin meiosis 2, not finish it unless it's ovulated, and then finally fertilized. Now, at all of these stages, these oocytes are going to be surrounded by follicles. So the follicle will be getting progressively larger. And there are cells that surround that follicle that produce estrogen. So that will be a big hormone in the female that is pretty important for regulating the female reproductive cycle. So let's get into the hormones that drive the female reproductive cycle. So, over here. Remember, GnRH coming from the hypothalamus, going to the anterior pituitary and stimulating FSH and LH. So these are two important hormones in the female also. Of course, this will be different because we're going on to the female, but this is the same. So we're going to follow the ovarian cycle first, because the ovarian cycle drives what is happening in the uterus. And there's a chart at the end of your slideshow that shows this in a slightly different way, similar to this, but a little bit different, but it's got all the same information on it. So this is basically an explanation of the chart. So for the female, we start out with gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and that stimulates the production of FSH and LH, or follicle-stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. So here we have each week, and this is depending on a 28-day cycle. So this would be the first day, or the first day of the first week, then the second week, third week, beginning of the fourth week, and so the end of the fourth week down here, which is where we would go back to the beginning to start over. But some people have different length of cycles, or it may not be regular at all, so this is just a general guideline. But we start out with GnRH coming out of the hypothalamus and triggering FSH and LH. But what FSH is going to do is it stimulates the primary follicles to produce estrogen. Now there are cells that are part of the primary follicle that are called the granulosa cells. These are going to end up as being what's called the zona pellucida of the oocyte, which is sort of like the eggshell, if you think of it that way. It's a hard outer casing that surrounds the oocyte. So that becomes incorporated into the oocyte itself. And then there are thecal cells, and those are the cells of the follicle itself. So we'd have the oocyte here, and then the follicle around here. So there would be the thecal cells. There would be the granulosa cells. Both are making estrogen. And estrogen is going to trigger the production of more LH. So follicle stimulating hormone, this is why it's called follicle stimulating hormone. It's stimulating the follicles to grow, to develop, to produce estrogen, and then that estrogen is going to be causing more luteinizing hormone, which is going to be important later, because this is going to take a little bit of time as this primary follicle is growing and finishing meiosis 1 and all of that, going into a secondary follicle or a secondary oocyte. So all of that's going to take a bit of time. So it's going to take some time for the LH to really start building up. So really in the first week, FSH is the main player. Now, while FSH is working, inhibins, remember inhibins from the male reproductive system, that is going to also be starting to build up slowly to inhibit the GnRH, which would be decreasing. But this is going to take some time too, so it's going to be a little bit of time before the inhibins start working on inhibiting the GnRH. Now, by the end of the first week, the follicle has been being stimulated. FSH is building up production of estrogen, so we have more estrogen happening. This is where the follicles finish meiosis 1, turn into a secondary follicle, which then develops, still under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone, into that tertiary follicle. We haven't completed meiosis 2 yet. That wouldn't happen until after ovulation and fertilization. So it's not finishing meiosis 2, but it's finishing meiosis 1, creating these secondary and tertiary follicles. So the follicle is getting bigger and bigger. We're having more estrogen as that follicle develops, and that leads to more luteinizing hormone, so more LH because of the estrogen. So as we go into the second week, or the third week here, lost my week, so day 14 here, so in the middle of the cycle, we're starting to see a lot more of that luteinizing hormone because it's been building up from the beginning, so day 1 all the way until now, which is day 14. So we have something called the luteinizing hormone surge. So lots and lots of luteinizing hormone. And what that does is it causes the tertiary follicle to complete its meiosis 1, which will then begin the process of meiosis 2. And then finally trigger ovulation. And if you remember from lab, where we have the tertiary follicle, and after ovulation it bursts and you have the corpus hemorrhagicum, and then that turns into the corpus luteum. Oops. So the corpus luteum, that's why this is called the luteinizing hormone, because it causes the formation of the corpus luteum. And what the corpus luteum is going to do is it secretes a hormone called progestin, or progesterone, which is probably the form that you've heard of it before. Progesterone is just a specific kind of progestin. Now, progestins are going to also inhibit GnRH, just like inhibins do. But because we're having, the buildup of the inhibins starting from day 1, and then now around day 21, we have this sudden surge of progestins coming out of the corpus luteum. It's going to have a big inhibitory effect on the GnRH. So a drop in GnRH, a drop in FSH, and a drop in LH. When we drop all of those hormones, so follicles stimulating hormone no longer stimulating the follicle, that's going to decrease estrogen itself, which also helps to decrease luteinizing hormone in turn. So all of the hormone levels are plummeting at this point except for progesterone. So what happens then is that corpus luteum, if there's no pregnancy that occurs, the corpus luteum is going to go through a process called involution. And that just means it essentially degenerates into scar tissue called the corpus albicans, which you probably remember from lab also. This isn't going to do anything. It's not secreting progesterone, so no more progesterone. So at this stage, towards day 21, 23, 24, somewhere around there, depending on each person, it's different. You have a lack of progesterone, you have a lack of estrogen, a lack of GnRH, FSH, and LH. So not a whole lot of hormones going on, just a plummeting of hormones. So in a nutshell, you start out the month with low levels of hormones, so no hormones essentially, not no hormones, but very low levels of hormones. Then they start to build up as you have no progesterone coming out and no more inhibins. You can start to build up the GnRH again, start triggering FSH and LH, and we start stimulating the estrogen, which triggers more LH, and we just keep building up, and the follicles are developing. They're getting larger, producing more estrogen. We're going into the second part of this phase, building up even more FSH, building up more estrogen, more luteinizing hormone, until we finally hit this part where we have the surge of LH, which causes the completion of meiosis 1 and the beginning of meiosis 2, and then at last ovulation due to the surge of luteinizing hormone. Then you have the corpus luteum, which secretes the progesterone, and that, in concert with the inhibins that have been building up slowly throughout this whole process, is going to inhibit your GnRH. All the hormone levels plummet, and we go back to the start again. So this is a monthly cycle. Now, all of these hormones are having an effect on what's happening in the uterus. And in the uterus, what we're really focusing on is the endometrium. So the endometrium is lined with a bunch of stuff. Essentially, it's a mucous membrane that is serving as a place for an embryo to implant if a pregnancy or fertilization were to occur. And if there's no fertilization, if there's no pregnancy, then there's no need to keep that endometrium, and you need to shed it and get rid of it so that you can make room for a new endometrial lining to form. So that's going to be the phase or the cycle of the uterus every month, building up the endometrium and then shedding it, and building it up and then shedding it every month. And that's driven by all these hormone changes that are happening coming out of the ovaries. So in the beginning of the cycle, day 1, the endometrial lining is going to proliferate. So it's called the proliferative phase because it's growing. And this is caused by estrogen. So estrogen is triggering a thickening of the endometrium. And that's going to, start out pretty thin, and it's going to get thicker as we go through the second week. And as we enter into the third week, we start to get into something called the secretory phase, which is where mucus secretion starts happening into the endometrium. And that is driven by estrogen, but also by the progesterone that's coming out of the corpus luteum. So the mucus would be kind of starting right there, right around ovulation. Now, as the progesterone continues to build up coming out of the corpus luteum and then starts inhibiting GnRH, and we have that big drop of all the hormones that we talked about, that drop in hormones is going to trigger the menses phase, which is where the endometrial lining is shed. Now, if pregnancy were to occur, then of course this wouldn't happen. The whole involution thing wouldn't happen. The corpus luteum would stay. Those progesterones would become a hormone that's helpful for the pregnancy. So this is all assuming no pregnancy here. Okay, so that is the reproductive system in 25 minutes or less. So this is our last video for this semester. So that's it. That's your job for this week. Watch this video, read those slides, and I'll see you next week.